Hello, and welcome to the first episode in my brand new series, Project Slave 1. In this series, I'm going to 3D print, build, and finish a studio-scale model of my favourite spaceship, Slave 1. A long time ago, in a cinema far, far away, I saw the greatest of the Star Wars sequels, Episode 5, The Empire Strikes Back. Released in 1980, 3 years after Star Wars, it features all the main characters of the saga and introduces a few new ones. One such character was Boba Fett, the most feared bounty hunter in the galaxy. I thought Boba Fett was the coolest character in the movie and loved seeing him on the screen. And when I saw his ship, Slave 1, I was totally captivated. Slave 1, like many of the ships in the Star Wars universe, is unlike anything else ever seen. The unique design of Boba Fett's ship had me mesmerised, and when it took off, its sound and method of flight amazed me. I still had the Empire Strikes Back sketchbook, which I bought for £6 when it first came out. This had the original concept sketches of Slave 1 and many other vehicles from the movie. We'll take a look at those a little later. Recently I bought this book on the Star Wars vehicles. It's full of highly detailed cutaways, skillfully showing the engineering behind some of the most iconic ships from the saga. Fortunately, there are two cutaways of Slave 1, one from Episode 2 and another from Episode 5. These are great and will definitely help me work out what's going on inside Slave 1, in particular the cockpit, which as you'll see is going to be a major challenge. Slave 1 was mainly designed by Nilo Rodis Dramiro at Industrial Light and Magic. His concept art portrayed a unique spaceship design, the character of which was expertly recreated by the model makers for Empire Strikes Back. There was a rumour that the idea for the design of Slave 1 came from a streetlight near Industrial Light and Magic. I can see the resemblance, but this rumour has since been denied by the designers. I had wanted to make a model of Slave 1 for a long time, but kits were either too small, inaccurate, or not available. I wanted to make a model a decent size, and with scratch building and 3D printing, I could do just that, but I couldn't find any decent source material, such as plans. One day over the Christmas break, cruising the net, I found a site selling files for 3D printing, called Gambody, and on it was Slave 1. The 3D model not only looked reasonably accurate, but was the size and level of detail I was after. The 1:34 scale model comes out at just over 2 feet long, 2 feet wide and a foot tall, so it's going to be a decent size, just what I'm after. It even comes with a display stand, which I'm not going to need as I'm going to mount it on the wall. This was probably the quickest purchase I've ever made and allowed me to download all the files I needed. There are two sets of STL files for 3D printing, one for an FDM printer and the other for a resin printer. The purchase price gives you access to both sets. I could see that there were some issues with the model I would like to change, but I figured out there was nothing too serious that I couldn't fix. There are lots of 3D models to choose from on the Gambody site. There's a link in the description to Slave 1, so you can check it out. What I needed now was some good reference material of the original studio model. Again, I lucked out and found this great site, Modelers, Miniatures and Magic. It's a terrific resource for anyone looking to build a sci-fi movie model. There are hundreds of excellent reference photos on here, and of course, a section on Slave 1. These were taken when Slave 1 was on display at a touring exhibition, and give some great close-up detail. I'll be referring to these frequently throughout the build. Check out the Modelers, Miniatures and Magic site for some inspiration. There's a link in the description. And here are some of those gorgeous images. Back in the day, the model was made with details added from various commercial plastic kits, so it's not unusual to recognise a part from a tank here or a car there. There are some parts I've already identified, but I'll point those out as we go through the project. From these photos, I'm sure I can create a good representation of Boba Fett's ship, and I hope you'll come along with me for the ride. There are a few issues I'm not quite sure about yet, but I do have some options, but more on those later. So make sure you subscribe to my channel to follow along with my progress on Slave 1. I think you're also supposed to smash the bell icon so you get notified of the next episode as well. I think that's a good thing. When you download the Slave 1 files from Gambody, You also get a set of instructions. These are really well produced and clearly show where everything goes and the correct order to assemble all the parts. They also have a list of printer settings to get the best result when it comes to 3D printing the model. I put them in this binder to keep them clean and in the right order. The next thing to do was start printing. I prepared the parts in my slicer software and made a few tweaks to the settings. I went up to a 0.6mm nozzle on the printer to try and reduce the print times as I had so many parts to print. I also increased the outer wall thickness as I knew I'd ultimately be doing a lot of sanding and modifying of the prints. This would increase the print time, but I figured increasing the nozzle size would balance it out. This is one of the lower hull parts that I could print without any support structure. You can see how thick the outer walls are and how the inside is printed as a honeycomb. Most of the parts can be printed without support, which is a testimony to how well the model has been thought out and designed. Unfortunately, some parts do need supports, like this part of the wing. The pale blue is all support material, which will have to be removed after printing. This can be tedious and messy. This is printed with the same basic settings as the hull part, just with supports. You can orientate the part as you wish to minimise the need for supports, but this was the best solution I came up with for this part. To keep track of the parts I was printing, as well as the print time and material use, I made a parts list. Knowing how much material a part used was important, so that I always had enough available on the printer for the part I was printing. I always print in ABS, which runs well on my printer. The printer also has to be enclosed to keep the temperature up and stable, which is why I don't have any footage of the printing. And here's all the parts. I reckon that in total I used about 5 kilos of ABS, so Slave 1 is going to be a big, heavy model. Laid out, you can start to identify some of the distinctive parts that make up Slave 1. The radar dish, engine parts, and the parts that make up the profile of the main hull. There were some parts that I knew I wouldn't need, so they didn't get printed. There were also a few smaller parts, such as the guns, which I decided to print on my resin printer, but all these parts are from my Ultimaker. The great thing about buying the files is that if I do screw up a part, I can always print out a replacement. This is a typical 3D print, in this case, the end of the lower hull. It was printed without supports and is very clean and smooth, with the layer lines hardly showing. The corner is a bit sketchy, but that's easily cleaned up and filled. Remember that wing part? Well, this is how it came out, covered in support material. And here's the other side, with all the supports removed. It leaves a bit of a mess, but it'll clean up okay with some TLC. To join everything together, I had to print out a load of these tabs that slot into the parts, making sure everything is kept well aligned. They just clip into place, and the 3 little dots in the middle show that you have the part in far enough. Now let's start putting some parts together. I decided to ignore the instructions, but with a few good reasons. I knew I was going to heavily modify the cockpit, so I didn't want to start on that until I had a plan. I wanted to practice my assembly technique on a simple part of the build, so I started on the rear lower hull. The tabs went in well, and the parts joined perfectly. After this test fit, they were then reassembled with large amounts of superglue. The 3 pairs of parts for the rear lower hull all went together well and could then be joined together. And here they are, forming a complete shell. The joints need filling and it needs some sanding and the edges cleaned up, but it's looking pretty good. I've filed off all the detail as most of it's wrong anyway, and it gets in the way of sanding. The holes appear because the print just has a thin shell, so removing the detail lumps and bumps exposes the inside of the print. It's nothing filler won't fix. The panel lines are getting filled anyway. This next section is the front of the back, or the back of the front. Anyway, you'll see. I put all the connectors in and gave it a good dose of superglue, so it wasn't going to come apart. Now to join the new section to the rear hull. I should have tested this first. It just wouldn't line up and go together. After I took out a few locators, it finally went together. I must remember that for the future. At least with all the superglue, it won't be coming apart. And here it is, glued and sanded back. It's now starting to get rather heavy. Well, I did use a lot of filament. After checking the reference photos, I've noticed that the bottom edge of the lower hull should be a sharp edge, not like the chamfer I have. That's an easy fix. So far, it's all going well. For my purposes, the quality of the 3D prints is perfect. The lines all have to be filled and rescribed. The two that mark out the boarding ramp are supposed to be parallel. Ultimately, all I need from the 3D prints is the base model of Slave 1. All the detail is going to be scratch built, and that's the part I enjoy the most. It's straightforward when you have all the information, but sometimes working out what's going on can be a real problem. Fortunately, I now have access to some great reference photos. But that poses its own set of questions. Which movie version do I go for? How much do I base on the reference book, and how much do I interpret myself? Let me know your thoughts in the comments. So, this is where I'm at so far. There's still a fair way to go, but I reckon that in the next episode I should have all the main body of Slave 1 assembled, and soon, judging by the progress so far. I hope you've enjoyed the first episode of Project Slave 1. If you have, hit the like button and make sure you subscribe to my channel. So you catch my next video when it goes live, click on the bell icon. If you have any questions about Project Slave 1, just leave them in the comments and I'll get back to you. Thanks for watching.